This is how Herodotus, the ancient Greek father of history, describes the military customs of the Scythians, nomadic invaders who struck terror in Greek hearts. The Scythian soldier drinks the blood of the first man he overthrows in battle. Whatever number he slays, he cuts off all their heads and carries them to the king. Since he is entitled to a share of the booty, he forfeits all claim if he does not produce a head. The Scyth is proud of scalps and hangs them from his bridle rein. The greater the number that a man can show, the more highly is he esteemed among them. Many make themselves cloaks by sewing a quantity of these scalps together. Who are these Scythians, these brutal warriors whose appearance on the edges of civilizations so terrified the Greeks and many other ancient states? In this lecture, we consider the role of militarized pastoral nomads like the Scythians in the history of civilizations to try and understand why they had such a devastating impact on all the states and civilizations they interacted with over thousands of years. We'll also consider the enormously positive effect they had in providing vital links between one civilization and another, and examine the forces that governed their lives and compelled them to thrust themselves into the lives of neighboring peoples. Pastoralism emerged as a viable lifeway several thousand years ago when some human communities realized that it was possible to live well by exploiting the products of domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, camels, goats, or horses. This lifeway was semi-nomadic for reasons we will soon see, and as a result, pastoralists never established civilizations such as those of Mesopotamia or Egypt with their great cities and stable, stratified societies. But their interactions with virtually every single complex state across Afro-Eurasia over thousands of years were crucial to the way history unfolded in that vast world zone. As we have seen, following the agricultural revolution, some communities embraced farming and became solely dependent on agriculture for their survival, a lifeway that required full-time sedentism. Other communities preferred to continue as nomadic foragers, often by migrating into areas outside of the sedentary zones, perhaps following conflicts over resources with the farmers. Yet others, the pastoralists, embraced a third lifeway, a specialized hybrid that incorporated elements of both farming and foraging. Pastoralists opted for a semi-sedentary, semi-nomadic existence that was dependent on the domestication of certain species. So this was a specific survival choice that some communities embraced within the broad framework of the agricultural revolution. But pastoralism did not appear 10,000 years ago with the transition to agriculture. Archaeologist Andrew Sherratt points out that pastoralism was only able to emerge early in the 5th millennium BCE, after humans worked out ways of using animal products, a change that Sherratt dubbed the secondary products revolution. Although sheep, goats, and cattle had all been domesticated from at least 6000 BCE, it was only when humans had learned to exploit the traction power of these animals, as well as their secondary products like blood, milk, and hair, that some communities were able to use them to greatly extend their range and eventually colonize large areas of grassland otherwise unsuitable for farming. The specific environment in which pastoralists lived, the Eurasian steppe, was critical for the operation of pastoralism because although the steppe cannot support sustained cultivation, it can sustain seasonal pastures of grasslands. Humans cannot eat the grass that grows in the steppe environment, but they can eat and use the animals that graze on it, thus tapping into an otherwise unusable energy source. The Eurasian steppe is a vast belt of grassland that extends 5,000 miles from the Oldfold Plain in Hungary and Romania in the west, through the Ukraine and Central Asia, all the way to Manchuria in the east. Far from being a uniformly flat expanse of grassy plains, however, the steppe varies considerably in its geography. At various places, the steppe is interrupted by rivers, hills, high mountains, and arid deserts, effectively dividing the vast ocean of grass into different regions. These often forbidding dividing features were never a real barrier to the pastoral nomads, so various groups could and often did interact with each other and with sedentary societies across the entire length and breadth of the Eurasian steppe. But often these dividing features did serve as places of refuge for nomads fleeing pursuing armies sent by the sedentary societies that the nomads had probably just finished raiding. Two examples of the extraordinary reach of militarized pastoral nomads that are no doubt familiar to you are the Huns, who proved so problematic for the Germanic tribes and Romans late in the Roman imperial period, and the Mongols, who in the 13th century carved out the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. More about both these formidable warrior confederations later. But the Huns and Mongols are simply the best known of a large number of powerful militarized nomadic confederations that proved so difficult for even the most powerful agrarian civilizations to deal with, even as they also proved beneficial to these same civilizations by linking them together into networks of trade and exchange. Let's take a closer look at how the steppe environment, both the grasslands and the intervening geographical features, influenced the lifeway of the nomads. To prevent overgrazing on the steppes, pastoralist families often lived by themselves or in small clusters with their flocks and herds, and rotated their pastures seasonally. Because they were highly dependent on the products of their animals as they migrated, the pastoral diet consisted mostly of dairy products such as cheese, yogurt, and a fermented alcoholic drink made from mare's milk called kumis, supplemented with meat from their animals and from hunting. The slaughtering of their herds and flocks had to be managed very carefully, because not only did the pastoralist very survival depend upon maintaining their animals, but the animals also served as the nomads' wealth. In addition to providing most of their food, animal byproducts such as wool, hair, horns, and leather provided the nomads materials for most, but not all, of their needs. This lack of complete self-sufficiency meant that trading with sedentary societies was necessary. So a sort of symbiotic relationship often developed between pastoralists and their sedentary neighbors. The nomads would trade their animal products and some of their animals, horses in particular, in exchange for silk, grains, weapons, tools, and other luxury items not provided by the steppe environment. Within their small clusters of household groups, everyone, men, women, and children, had specific and important roles in maintaining the lifeway, particularly food production, which meant that a relatively egalitarian social structure emerged. Their portable dwellings, which could be quickly set up or packed away, were mainly round, tent-like shelters known commonly as yurts, essentially wooden lattice walls covered by layers of felt. The entire camp could pack up and move quickly and on short notice. And sometimes these movements took on the form of great tribal migrations when large numbers of camps moved at the same time, perhaps because of climate pressure or through being displaced by a more powerful neighbor. The definition of the word tribe, by the way, is a challenging term for historians to define, particularly in the context of pastoral nomads, and there are several different interpretations. In general, we can say that a tribe is a socio-political group based on familial ties to a real or fictitious ancestor. And the identity of the tribe is taken from the dominant group to whom the tracing of this kinship relationship actually mattered. Membership of the tribe varied through time and as members came and went, but as long as the dominant group maintained its hegemony over the subgroups, the identity of the tribe remained that of the ruling element. The ruling group seldom had complete dominance in a pastoral nomadic tribe, however, and members would regularly consult subgroup leaders to maintain tribal harmony. Even the highest leaders, think of Attila the Hun or the great Mongol leader Chinggis Khan, were more like semi-elected officials who were skilled in warfare, but also able to manage social relations within the group. The steppe environment also fostered the formidable military skills of the nomads because it gave them several distinct advantages over sedentary forces. First, militarized nomads were incredibly well disciplined, having undergone rigorous training from a young age and perfecting their skills through regular long and demanding hunts across the steppes. Nomadic forces were also perfectly tailored for mobility and speed. The cavalry were lightly armored, and because they had been trained to live off the land through the hunts, units were able to function independently of supply lines. The commanders of militarized nomadic forces tended to carry out very carefully planned campaigns that relied upon reconnaissance and accurate intelligence about the strength and deployment of their enemies. Militarized nomads could also traverse large distances quickly, even in appallingly cold winters, sometimes using frozen rivers almost as interstate highways to plunge unexpectedly into the heart of cities along the banks. These horse-riding archers were also superbly skilled with a composite bow and arrow, which they could use with incredible accuracy because of years of practice in hunts and in battle. And they were no slouches with their other weapons either, axes, swords, and maces, to name just three. And finally, as the quote from Herodotus suggests, militarized nomads were highly skilled in their use of terror tactics, both to control conquered peoples, but also to send brutal messages to would-be enemies, as the Mongols so supremely demonstrate. But as we have noted, despite establishing symbiotic commercial relationships with sedentary farming communities and being formidable warriors when required, pastoral nomads were also crucial in facilitating long-distance exchanges between what were otherwise quite isolated civilizations and states, making networks such as the Silk Roads viable. Before the appearance of pastoralists in the more marginal steppe, desert, and high mountain environments, many agrarian civilizations really were very isolated from each other. But because the nomads could survive and prosper in the harsh interior of Afro-Eurasia, once these communities emerged, they facilitated the linking up of all the different structures, lifeways, and communities. Ultimately, even as we acknowledge the military prowess of the pastoralists, it was their role as facilitators and protectors of trade that accounts for their immense historical importance during the era of agrarian civilizations. Although Andrew Sherratt has estimated the arrival of pastoral nomadism at some time after 5000 BCE, the chronology of its historical origins and spread remains obscure. Archaeologists have found evidence of farming communities that seem particularly dependent on domesticated animals, including the horse, within certain early cultures that appeared in the Ukraine and parts of southern Russia. The site of Dorivka on the right bank of the Dnieper River in Ukraine is particularly fascinating in this context. Large herds of horses seem to have been kept here based on the high percentage of horse bones and horse riding material discovered. By the time the first cities and states appeared in Afro-Eurasia, late in the 4th millennium BCE, pastoralist lifeways had become so productive that entire communities were now able to depend almost exclusively on their animals. The more they did this, however, and with the proviso of still having to trade or raid periodically with sedentary societies, the more nomadic they had to be so that they could graze their animals over large areas. The appearance of burial mounds called kurgani scattered across the steppe is evidence of increasing nomadism in some of these communities, and the distribution of kurgans shows a gradual eastwards spread. There were various degrees of pastoral nomadism, ranging from groups that had no permanent settlements at all to communities of largely sedentary pastoralists who lived in permanent settlements. An early and very important domesticated animal for pastoralists was the camel. One-hump camels or dromedaries were probably domesticated in Arabia during the 3rd millennium BCE, and soon after there is evidence of the use of two-humped Bactrian camels as draft animals, a talent that would be fully exploited during the Silk Roads eras when Bactrians would carry large quantities of Chinese silk from China deep into Central Asia. The impact of migrating pastoralists across Eurasia, an impact again that resulted from their mobility and their ability to survive in marginal environments, was immediate and profound. Archaeologists trace cycles of expansion across the steppe with periods of semi-sedentism in between, cycles probably explained by climate and demographic pressures. In periods of warmer and wetter weather, agriculture may have become a more viable alternative in regions once suited only to nomadism. And in time, large sedentary communities developed around the winter camps of regional leaders as rooms added onto tents converted them into houses. But once conditions changed and became less favorable to farming, the pastoralists returned to nomadism, often migrating vast distances across Eurasia. So climate pressure remains the most likely explanation for these periods of increased migration, and comparisons between fluctuations in temperature and rainfall in the steppes and archaeological evidence of migrations by pastoral nomads do seem to correspond. Russian archaeologists have distinguished 3 cycles of large-scale migration in the millennia before the Common Era, between roughly 34 and 3200, 26 and 2400, and a third wave between 2000 and 1800 before the Common Era. These migrations represent the invasion of large regions of Eurasia by various groups of Indo-European speaking pastoral nomads who traveled eastwards from their probable homeland somewhere in southern Russia. With each wave of migration, the pattern of Kurgan shows that pastoralists were spreading further and further to the east through southern Siberia and Central Asia, extending eventually into Mongolia and Western China. Much of the archaeological evidence for the early Bronze Age cycle of expansion comes from the western steppes, particularly the pit-grave Yamnaya pastoralist culture that flourished from the region between the Bug and Dniester rivers in the west and the Ural River in the east. These so-called pit-grave cultures provide evidence of horse riding and also of the use of wheeled vehicles on the steppe that might have been vital in the logistics of mass migration. Vehicles such as 2- and 4-wheeled wagons that were probably pulled by oxen. Many of the metal goods discovered in Yamnaya sites, including weapons like daggers, axes and maces, had been imported from agricultural metalworking zones, evidence that pastoralists, farmers and artisans of the western steppes were already linked into a regional system of commercial exchanges by the late 4th millennium. By the Middle Bronze Age, Indo-European speaking pastoral nomads had migrated further to the east, occupying parts of southern Siberia and the Central Asian steppe, driven most probably by overpopulation and climate change in the western steppe. The most important pastoralist culture of the central and southern steppe is that of the Afanassivo, named after the site of Afanassiva Gora in southern Siberia, first excavated by the Soviets in 1920. Afanassivo artifacts show distinct similarities to those of the pit-grave cultures, suggesting that the Afanassivo was an extension of pastoral nomadic migrants from the west, combined with the assimilation of local indigenous populations. By the late Bronze Age, there is evidence of a new wave of large-scale migration, which seems to have caused widespread disruption across many regions of the steppe. The steppe bronze culture that emerged in the wake of this invasion is known as the Andronovo. The Andronovo lived in small, fortified villages and towns in large houses that were partly subterranean. Their economy was based on the breeding of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses, and their lifeway varied between mobile pastoralism and occasional periods of semi-sedentary agriculture. Some Andronovan settlements became quite large, essentially fortified towns. Archaeologists have excavated royal tombs and discovered chariots, an indication that the Andronovans may have been forced to fight local communities as they expanded, seeking grazing territory. Unlike the situation in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, however, the chariot was not destined to have a significant military impact on inner Eurasian geopolitics. We know that the chariot transformed warfare in Mesopotamia, Egypt, South Asia, and East Asia, but the chariot was less practical in the steppe environment of Central Asia, and it was replaced from about 1000 BCE by the much more effective horse-riding archer warriors using bows and arrows. During the first millennium BCE, a number of pastoral nomadic communities emerged with the military skills and technologies and the endurance and mobility to raid at will and even dominate their sedentary agrarian neighbors. Some of these militarized groups, like the Xiongnu, Yuecha, Huns, and Scythians, formed powerful state-like confederations in the steppe lands between the agrarian civilizations. As with other pastoral nomads, these were not civilizations because they lacked many of the crucial features we have used to define them. They had no cities, no large, dense populations, no monumental architecture, and in most cases, no writing. However, their political structure and military prowess allowed these often very substantial confederations to not only live well on the steppes, but also to develop military horse-riding contingents that became formidable opponents of the armies of all sedentary civilizations. It was the domestication of the horse that was critical in the prowess of militarized nomads. So let's step back for a moment and take a look at how this extraordinary animal came to be available for their use in the otherwise largely deserted landscape of the steppes. The ancestor of the horse appeared during the early Eocene epoch some 55 million years ago, a tiny hoofed browsing mammal known as Eohippus, the dawn horse, that stood no more than 18 inches high. It took a little over 52 million years, but by about 2.6 million years ago, Equus, the genus to which all modern equines, including horses, asses, and zebras belong, appeared on the North American plains. Equus stood about 4 feet tall and was so well adapted to the environment that by 2 million years ago, it had spread from the plains of North America to South America and to extensive regions of Eurasia. Equus flourished in its North American homeland throughout the Pleistocene, but then it disappears from the fossil record there around 10,000 years ago, probably as a result of overhunting by early human migrants to the Americas. This is one of the great ironies of world ecological history. The animal that had evolved and flourished in the Americas was hunted to extinction in that world zone and was only reintroduced to the Americas in the early 16th century by Spanish conquistadors. And it was this reintroduction that eventually facilitated the rise of the superb horse-riding plains Indians like the Comanche and Apache. But the wild horse flourished in Eurasia and was eventually domesticated during the 5th millennium BCE, probably somewhere in the stepplands of the Ukraine, perhaps even at Berivka, although the actual process of domestication remains unclear. There are several key questions about this process. Was there a single place of domestication or multiple places? Did early domesticated horses spread throughout Eurasia, or was it the practice of horse domestication that spread to new areas? And if it was the domestication practice, did local breeders capture their own wild horses and introduce them into the domesticated horse gene pool? Modern genetic techniques have been helpful in trying to answer these questions, but in different regions, the horse genome has yielded different results. Studies of mitochondrial DNA show considerable diversity among individuals, supporting the idea that there were multiple sites of domestication and that horses from different geographical areas contributed to the domestic horse. This supports the theory that humans spread domestic horses from Western Eurasia and that domestic populations were supplemented with wild individuals, increasing the genetic diversity of domestic horses and also the widespread practice of interbreeding within the species. It's hard to imagine any other animal that has had a more extraordinary impact upon human history than the horse, a product of evolutionary processes that began 55 million years ago in the woodlands of ancient North America. This was also an energy revolution, of course. Think of how we still measure the strength of our automobiles in horsepower. And it was horse domestication that allowed militarized pastoral nomads like the Xiongnu, Huns, and Mongols to become strong enough to challenge the great agrarian civilizations. The Scythians, of whom Herodotus wrote in the 5th century BCE, were one such nomadic confederation that employed horses to especially deadly effect. At its height, the Scythian realm stretched from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains in Siberia, although as far as Herodotus knew, the Scythian world was much smaller, extending from the Danube to the Don River. Like most pastoral nomadic confederations, the Scythians did not leave any written sources. So for much of their history, we have to depend on accounts from sedentary cultures like the Greeks, and also archaeological evidence from thousands of excavated tombs. Even with this evidence, we don't really know if there was a single Scythian group or several different groups who shared a common culture that archaeologists describe as Scythian because of certain similarities. Their ethnic identity is also uncertain, although they were most probably Indo-European speaking migrants who intermingled with other sedentary and nomadic groups. When we use a term like Scythian then, or Xiongnu or Han, we are using it to describe confederations of nomads that shared a common culture, the use of composite bows, for example, or a particular type of sword, or common artistic motifs such as stags fighting, or widespread use of iron weapons and sophisticated riding harnesses. Rather than thinking of the Scythian realm as an empire, think of it as a tribal confederation in which the Scythians were the dominant elite. Herodotus himself distinguished several groups within the Confederation, and he called the true Scythians the Royal Scythians. The Scythian Confederation contained its fair share of fast-moving horse archers, but it also included various sedentary cultures who dwelt along the northern coast of the Black Sea. Perhaps to protect these sedentary subjects, the Scythians built massive hill fortresses in Ukraine. One near Poltava had defensive walls 34 kilometers in length, enclosing an area of 4,000 hectares. In the 700s BCE, the Scythians forced a rival militarized nomadic confederation, the Cimmerians, to move away from the Black Sea steppes and south into the Middle East. The Scythians pursued their enemies, which brought them into conflict with powerful sedentary states, including the Assyrians and the Medes, who seemed to have no idea of how to deal with this first wave of militarized nomads to contest with sedentary civilizations. Herodotus informs us that the Scythian army remained in the region for 28 years before returning to the steppes, leaving behind a collapsed Assyrian empire. The tables were turned on the Scythians when they were attacked by the armies of the Persian Empire. For more than a century, powerful Persian kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius I attempted to subdue the Scythians. But these campaigns generally failed because the Scythians, like all militarized nomadic armies, used their mobility to simply retreat back into the steppe, and from their strongholds there, send troops out to harass their less mobile opponents. Darius famously complained that they would not stand and fight. During the 4th century BCE, the political structure of the Scythian Confederation was centralized until all the tribes were united under King Atheus. Trade and agriculture now became important parts of the Scythian economy, and this, along with increased contact with Greek colonies, increased the sedentization of the nomads. By the 2nd century BCE, Scythian dominance in the Black Sea region was waning after invasions by Celts and Sarmatians, although they still possessed sufficient military power to conquer Greek Black Sea colonies such as Cherson to maintain their dominance in regional trade. Yet even as Scythian power waned in the west, by this stage they had spread extensively eastwards across much of Inner Eurasia, so that later Greco-Roman and also Han Chinese sources were able to identify 3 distinct groups of Scythians, also known as Saka or as Sai to the Chinese. These were the Saka Tayai Paradrya of the Black Sea region, presumably the same groups known to Herodotus 3 centuries earlier, the Amerindian Saka, who were dwelling in the Issyk-Kul region and the Fergana Valley in modern Uzbekistan, and the Saka Tigrak-Sauda, located by the Greek historian Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE as living south of the Sirdarya, also in Uzbekistan. These more easterly groups were descendants of the original Black Sea Scythians that had moved deep into Central Asia, where they were destined to play a critical role. In the Black Sea region, however, the Scythians were reduced by Roman military actions to the status of a minor threat. And when the Goths moved into the Black Sea Scythian heartland in the 3rd century CE, the Scythians essentially ceased to exist as they mixed into the Gothic population. This sort of historical arc, from the appearance of the lifeway of pastoralism in the steppe to the evolution of some pastoralist tribes into powerful militarized confederations that challenged and often defeated even the greatest sedentary states and civilizations, but then to the eventual loss of power and dissolution as a distinct political entity, was repeated time and again across much of Inner Eurasia. It is the story of the Scythians, the Huns, the Xiongnu, even the mighty Mongols. And it reminds us again of the significant but often fleeting role pastoral nomads have played in world history. Pastoralists played a particularly critical role in the rise of civilization, but over the millennia, as sedentary civilizations grew and spread, their wandering way of life became a thing of the past.